Correct. I must have been smoking some tall grass, but this time I wasn't my own dealer. As you already know, I always bring you what you ask for. This video, in particular, exists thanks to a comment from Sick Life on my Pokemon Bikes video, so I got to work and found more than enough to bring you a pretty interesting episode. And before we begin, as is tradition with these kinds of videos, here's the usual bet. Since Pokemon trivia is one of the most overdone topics among PokeTubers, and it's hard to find new facts, if you discover at least 6 things in this video that you didn't know, you'll have to subscribe to the channel. Deal? Alright then, let's step into the tall grass and start with the reason why Pokemon hide in it in the first place. We can actually find the answer in the library of Canalave City in the Pokemon Diamond and Pearl games. There's a specific text that explains it. Long ago, when Sinnoh was created, humans and Pokemon lived separate lives. That doesn't mean they didn't help each other. Quite the opposite. They traded and supported one another. One Pokemon proposed that they should always be ready to help people. It asked that Pokemon answer the call of humans whenever needed. And since then, Pokemon appear when people walk through tall grass. Our next curiosity takes us all the way back to the very beginning of the franchise, even before the release of Pokemon Red and Green. In some pre-release versions, something wild happened. The encounter rate in tall grass was so absurdly high that players would run into Pokemon literally every 2 steps. The game was practically unplayable. On top of that, trainers in the overworld would challenge you every single time you walked in front of them, not just the first time before being defeated. Because of this, Game Freak decided to adjust both the wild encounter rate and trainer battles to make them more reasonable. Honestly, I'm glad they did. That tiny detail could have killed the entire franchise. Still in this first generation, there's another grass-related curiosity, specifically about cutting it. From Generation 1 to Generation 3, the HM cut could be used in the overworld to cut down grass, right? Well, in Generation 1, there are only 2 areas where this doesn't apply: Viridian Forest and the Safari Zone. These 2 places also share another oddity. They're the only areas in those games where grass tiles aren't arranged in 3x3 patches, but instead in 2x2 patches. In most areas, grass patches are groups of 9 tiles, but in Viridian Forest and the Safari Zone, they're groups of just 4 tiles. And if you think this was intentional, I doubt it. The restriction on cutting grass in these areas disappeared in Generation 2 and stayed removed in the Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green remakes of Kanto. Speaking of Generation 2, they introduced a new mechanic: very tall grass, a type of grass taller than usual. You can find it, for example, in the National Park, where the bug catching contest takes place. Here's the interesting part. If you use cut on this tall grass, instead of removing it entirely, it turns into normal grass, and then you can cut it a second time to remove it completely. Pretty curious, right? Now let's look at how the grass cutting mechanic evolved. In Generations 1 and 2, cut would remove a 2x2 area and 4 tiles. In Generation 3, this changed, allowing you to cut a 3x3 area. But here's something most people don't know. You can increase the area even further. If you have a Pokemon in your party with the ability Hyper Cutter that also knows cut, the area expands to a 5x5 square. Not bad, huh? And we're still not done with Generation 3. There's an even crazier detail reserved for one of the strangest places in Hoenn Faraway Island. If you remember, this is where you could capture Mew in a sort of chase sequence through tall grass. Cut can also be used here to clear the grass and make the chase easier. But here's the real twist. If you cut down all the grass in the area, Mew will disappear completely without battling you. Seems like the area was designed to be cheat-proof. And before moving on to Generation 4, here's a quick bonus fact. From Generation 1 all the way to Generation 8, when grass finally started being individually modeled instead of using preset square tiles, there are a total of 57 different grass types across the games. That includes seaweed, very tall grass, and other variations. I'll leave all of them on screen right here. Now, if we move on to Generation 4, we find a curiosity related to wild encounter rates in tall grass. You probably know that depending on how you move, the encounter rate changes. It's higher if you run, and lower if you simply walk. Well, in Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, very tall grass increases the wild encounter rate by the exact same amount as riding a bicycle. Curiously, this changes within the same generation. In Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, very tall grass only increases the encounter rate slightly more than walking, but a bit less than running. Yeah, I know. That one was espresso-level trivia, strictly for the hardcore fans. And if you thought Generation 4 was the only time they adjusted encounter rates based on how you cross grass, nope. They take this way more seriously than they probably should. For example, in Generation 7, with the introduction of Pokéride, you might assume all ride Pokémon share the same encounter rate modifier, right? Wrong. Every single one has its own specific rate. Kinda weird, isn't it? The last thing we'll mention about encounter rates takes us back to Generation 3, specifically Pokémon Emerald. There are several items that modify encounter rates exclusively in this version. I already find it odd that some items have effects in only one specific game, but here we are. The White Flute, Black Flute, and Cleanse Tag multiply the encounter rate by 0.8, 1.5, and 0.5 respectively. What's even stranger is that both flutes lost their encounter modifying effects in later generations. That is, until the Pokémon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire remakes of Hoenn, where instead of restoring their original effects, they were redesigned to modify the level of wild Pokémon you encounter. And that leads to another fascinating detail. Thanks to the level-reducing effect in these remakes, it's actually possible to encounter level 1 Pokémon in early routes, something that had never legitimately happened before in tall grass. In some games, you could fish up level 1 Magikarp but never encounter level 1 Pokémon in grass. In fact, from Generation 1 through 4, it was impossible to legitimately encounter level 1 Pokémon without external devices. And since we mentioned the Hoenn remakes, here's something really interesting that only happens in Generation 6. Let me introduce it with a question. Do you remember the very first wild Pokémon that appeared to you in Pokémon X and Y, or in Pokémon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire? Don't worry if you don't, I'll tell you. In Pokémon X and Y, it's always a Pidgey, specifically in the second row of grass on Route 2. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, it's always a Poochyena after exactly 3 steps on Route 101. How do I know? Because both first encounters are literally hard-coded into the games to always be those exact Pokémon. And staying on Route 101 in Hoenn, there's another hidden curiosity, a special Poochyena that can know one of the elemental Fang moves depending on which starter you chose. If you picked Trico, it knows Thunder Fang. If you picked Mudkip, it knows Fire Fang. If you picked Torchic, it knows Ice Fang. Now let's move to Generation 5 and talk about shaking grass encounters, something I had honestly forgotten about. In Pokémon Black and White, shaking grass allows you to encounter Pokémon that would otherwise be impossible to obtain normally in that area. Examples include the elemental monkeys in Pinwheel Forest or evolved forms of Pokémon already present on the route. It's also the only way to obtain version-exclusive Pokémon like Throh in certain cases, making them otherwise unobtainable. Quick side note, not really a curiosity, but important. Shaking grass encounters only activate after you obtain your first gym badge. Why? No idea. Now let's shift into curiosities related to grass, but indirectly. I'm talking about moves, abilities, and items that interact with it. First, let's talk about abilities and escaping battles, something that seems obvious in hindsight but never really clicked for me. Starting in Generation 6, Ghost-type Pokémon became immune to trapping effects that prevent switching. That means moves like Mean Look or abilities like Arena Trap don't affect them. Additionally, from that same generation onward, Ghost types can always flee from battle regardless of speed. And here's the real curiosity. Because of this, there's a Pokémon with a completely useless ability. I'm talking about Gimmighoul, which can have the ability Runaway. Since it's a ghost type, Runaway is redundant. It already ignores trapping and can flee freely, so the ability literally does nothing. And if you'd rather avoid entering battles in tall grass altogether, here's something for you. Repels. Because apparently I have no life, I calculated the cost efficiency of every repel to determine the best purchase in the games. Surprisingly, the winner is the Super Repel. From Generation 7 onward, its cost per step is 3.5 Pokédollars, while Max Repel costs 3.6 per step. Regular Repel comes last at 4 per step. Our next curiosity involves a move whose effect can depend on whether you're in tall grass or not. I'm talking about Camouflage. This next curiosity takes us back to Generation 3, because it's the only generation where Camouflage could be replaced by a move that doesn't deal direct damage. If you use Camouflage while standing in tall grass, it will have the same effect as Stun Spore, paralyzing the target. And if you think that's where it ends, not even close. In this same generation, the in-game menu shows Camouflage as having 95% accuracy. That's actually false. The move will always execute, and its effective accuracy will instead depend on the move it calls in that specific situation. Interestingly, starting with Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the move's accuracy is listed listed as unspecified, reflecting how it truly works. Now let's move on to another move connected to wild encounters, Sweet Scent. Here's a pretty strange detail. Do you know where this move was first revealed? It actually made its debut in the Pokemon Adventures manga before ever appearing in the games. I don't know about you, but I find that pretty unusual. Now for our second to last curiosity, also related to Sweet Scent, and this one involves a bizarre glitch. In Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, if you use Sweet Scent inside a shop, or use the honey item, which has the same overworld effect, something weird happens. When you talk to shopkeepers afterward, the description text for items completely disappears. The glitch persists until you leave the store. And you might ask, what does that have to do with grass? Well, I personally like to imagine you release some kind of grass fumes into the air, and the shopkeepers get so dazed they can't even remember how to describe their own merchandise. And since we're talking about honey, let's end with one final curiosity about it. Although honey was officially introduced in Generation 4, it was originally intended to appear in Generation 2. Back then, the idea was that you would use it on trees to attract Pokemon, wait a full day, and then battle whatever showed up. As you can see, that mechanic is extremely similar to what we eventually got in Generation 4. Personally, I think this idea was ultimately replaced by the headbutt tree mechanic in Generation 2, because if you think about it, it's technically a very similar concept. And well, that's all for today. I'm sorry we didn't hit 20 plus curiosities this time, but hey, trivia doesn't grow on trees, or in grass apparently. Still, I hope you discovered some interesting facts and that I managed to win the bet I proposed at the beginning. If I did, I'd really appreciate you subscribing to the channel. You already know I always try to bring fresh topics to the Pokemon community. Did I miss any grass-related curiosities? Leave them in the comments. I read every single one. But for now, that's it from me. See you next time.